Reporting from Arkham Asylum, this is Gotham Rogues. In this video we explore the history of the Master of Fear himself, the Scarecrow. A quick announcement. My ebook, Cell 11, a horror novel about a supernatural prison cell, will be free for 5 days, starting today. So from today, Saturday, April 7th, to Wednesday, April 11th, you can get it for no cost whatsoever. A link is in the description. Get it while the offer still stands. When you've read it, I would very much appreciate if you gave it a rating and a review on Amazon. Because you see, books without ratings and reviews don't sell at all. Nobody wants to buy it unless someone else has tested the waters first. So anyway, let's dive deep into the ominous and frightening history of Jonathan Crane, that Prince of Panic, the Tyrant of Terror, better known to the world at large as the Scarecrow. Batman spent his first year or so mainly fighting various bland gangsters and generic mad scientists, but eventually came the day when creators Bill Finger and Bob Kane decided it was time to pit their Dark Knight detective against some more memorable foes. Thus, colorful and bizarre rogues like the Joker and the Penguin were introduced. Another one of these odd mugs was Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow. Crane made his first appearance in the 3rd issue of World's Finest Comics, published in 1941. The tale, by Finger and Kane of course, was called Riddle of the Human Scarecrow, but that title doesn't appear in the actual story. It's only featured in the table of contents of World's Finest number 3. The table of contents, naturally never being included in any reprints of the story, has caused some confusion over where that title actually comes from. Well, now you know. So in the story we meet Jonathan Crane, professor of psychology at a Gotham City university. Obsessed with fear, the peculiar fellow would usually spend his classes ranting on about fear's psychological effects on the mind, often employing radical means of demonstration, such as firing a live gun in class. This odd behavior, combined with his antisocial attitude, lanky physique, and shabby clothing, made him an outcast at the university, and also earned him the nickname Scarecrow. Eventually desiring more money, Crane decided to embrace this image, and adopted the moniker of the Scarecrow. Wearing a freaky costume and armed with an array of scare tactics, Crane sold his services to the shadier parts of society, scaring off his clients' enemies for a fee. Naturally, this Duke of Fright soon found himself at odds with Gotham's protectors, Batman and Robin. The character returned to pester the dynamic duo 2 years later, in a tale aptly titled The Scarecrow Returns. It was published in Detective Comics 73, and the writer was Don Cameron, while the penciler was once again good old Bob Kane. This time Crane ditched his fear theme entirely, and instead sent Batman clues related to his future crimes, stealing the gimmick of the Riddler several years before that character even existed. With 2 appearances across the span of 3 years to his credit, the Scarecrow wasn't exactly right up there with Batman arch-knaves, the Joker, Catwoman, and the Penguin, but he was still a semi-recurring villain with a lot of promising potential. However, unfortunately for the Master of Fear, that potential would go completely untapped for a very long duration, as in the following years, the character vanished into total obscurity. In 1967, writer Gardner Fox and artist Sheldon Moldoff decided to bring back that long-lost Batman villain known as the Scarecrow. 24 years had gone by since he last appeared, and the world of the Dark Knight had changed radically. It was the early golden age when Crane last fought the dynamic duo, and now the comic book industry found itself nearing the end of the Silver Age. A live-action TV show based upon the adventures of Batman and Robin was in its 2nd season, a spin-off movie was in the theaters, the Cape Crusader had a brand new look, and his stories were now filled with camp. Scarecrow, the forgotten rogue left behind during the Second World War, was a stranger in a strange land. His big comeback story titled Fright of the Scarecrow and published in Batman 189 featured the same old Johnny Crane, a scrawny geek looking for cash. This time around his fear gimmicks from the original story were back, but far more sophisticated. For the first time in the character's history, he used a compound that caused fear hallucinations, a spray that made Batman and Robin believe they were falling. Following this comic, the Prince of Panic went on to make 2 more appearances during the final days of the Silver Age, one of which cast him as the main villain in Batman's special 200th issue. In these stories, Crane's fear toxins continued to evolve. He used one drug that made everyone afraid of him, and one that made everyone afraid of Batman, including Batman himself. The Master of Fear had risen once again, and perhaps this frightful foe helped usher in a new, darker era of Batman comics. Meanwhile, in 1969, Scarecrow made his first jump from the comic book page to another form of media. The character was ignored by the live-action TV show, perhaps due to being too scary for its goofy style, but Crane did appear in one single episode of the Batman Superman Hour, an animated cartoon show. The episode was called The Great Scarecrow Scare, and featured a design very different from the one used in the comics. This version also had no fear drugs. Instead, he just used eggs filled with knockout gas. Because that's the same thing, right? Scarecrow was voiced by Ted Knight, like the rest of the rogues on the show, thus making him the first performer to ever play the character. Crane had certainly moved up in the world, going from being forgotten for 24 years to appearing in landmark Batman issues and on a cartoon show. But his triumphant comeback was still nothing compared to the miraculous success story of Edward Nygma, aka the Riddler, which we covered last in this series. Sure, Johnny was a major recurring Batrogue now, but he wasn't a pop culture icon. Your grandma may have known who the Riddler was, but she had never heard of the Scarecrow. The Master of Fear had just begun what would be a very slow and steep climb to fame. The Duke of Fright was for some reason absent during the early years of the Bronze Age, much like most of the classic Batrogues. However, their excuse was that they had appeared on a campy TV series, which DC wanted to distance themselves from. Who knows why Scarecrow was given the same treatment, and what an odd choice too, as he would have made a perfect fit for the airy Batman comics of the early 70s. Crane did eventually return in 1974, but it wasn't in a Batman story. Instead, it took place in Justice League of America 111. In the story, Johnny joined the newly formed Injustice Gang of the World, led by newcomer Libra, alongside a cadre of other DC rogues, including Mirror Master Cronus and his pal from Gotham City, Poison Ivy. Following this appearance, the Terror Tyrant continued to show up pretty frequently, and in Batman 296, published in 1978, the villain employed his trademark weapon for the very first time, the Fear Toxin, a drug that made you hallucinate your worst phobias and nightmares. It was a concoction more potent than any other he had ever used, as it supplied the victims with tailor-made frights designed to exploit their personal greatest fears. That same year, Crane made his second animated appearance, namely on the third season of the cartoon show Superfriends, Challenge of the Superfriends. This animated incarnation resembled more the version from the comics, and featured a dreadfully creepy voice performance by Don Messick, aka Scooby-Doo. He kinda sounds like me actually, maybe that's why people keep saying I should voice Crane. On the show, Scarecrow never used any fear toxin or any other drugs. Instead, he could seemingly command flocks of crows. The character was depicted as one of the many members of the Legion of Doom, a collection of vile DC knaves, including Cheetah, Sinestro, Brainiac, and fellow Gotham rogue Eddie Nygma. The Terror Tyrant returned for one single episode of the final Super Friends season, Superpowers Team Galactic Guardians, which aired in 1985. The episode was simply called The Fair, and is perhaps the most infamous Super Friends episode of them all, as it featured the very first portrayal of Batman's tragic origin outside of the comic books. This time around, Crane sported a brand new look, and Don Messick found himself replaced by Andrei Stoica. The character also, finally, utilized his fear drugs, and was given the identity of Jonathan Crane, a professor working as a police consultant on the Scarecrow case. He later makes Batman relive that fateful night when his parents were murdered in Crime Alley, psychologically breaking the Cape Crusader. The episode was a lot darker and more serious than any Batman story outside the source material had ever been, and remains to this day a landmark moment in both Batman and the Scarecrow's history. It seemed like whenever Crane was inserted into a corny and innocent context, like the late Silver Age comics, he always had a way of corrupting it, introducing some more mature psychology. The Master of Fear appeared fairly often in the comics during the 1980s, and he continued to experiment with his toxins. For instance, in Fear for Sale, published in Detective Comics 571 in 1986, Crane created a drug that removed a person's fears. That may not seem bad, but it's our fear that often saves us from doing something stupid. Like for example, fearing that we'll die, we don't jump in front of a speeding train. The Bronze Age and early days of the post-crisis era of DC Comics was a good time for the Prince of Panic. A good time, but not amazing. We got some real classic storylines in the comics, and with Super Friends the character finally broke into the mainstream. However, he was still far from an icon, and while Johnny was considered an A-list Batrogue, he wasn't quite up there with the top wolves like Joker, Two-Face and Penguin. Old Strawhead still had a long ways to go. In 1992, Batman the Animated Series made its smashing debut on the small screen. Here we had a cartoon show with sophisticated writing and dark themes, far beyond that of any other so-called children's programming. Scarecrow was a natural fit for the show, and appeared as one of the main recurring villains. He was voiced by Henry Pollack II for most of the series, while Jeffrey Combs, aka Dr. Herbert West, took over the role for the radically different last season. Combs' version was also depicted with a visual redesign, unlike any other look the character had ever sported before. While the animated series take on Crane is generally beloved by fans still to this day, the show didn't really do anything that the comics and Superfriends hadn't already done with the character. It did, however, help introduce him to an even wider audience than said comics and Superfriends ever could. Meanwhile, at the same time, Crane made his first jump into the world of video games, being featured in a few different games based on the animated series, alongside most of the show's rogues gallery. In 1995, the comics gave the character his first ever in-depth origin story with Batman Annual 19. The story, written by Doug Mensch and penciled by Brett Blevins, explored Johnny's past as a bullied geek in school, who eventually decided to take revenge on everyone who wronged him. It also established the character as a physical fighter, using a style called violent dancing, or the Crane style, a desperate and unnecessary attempt at making Crane more suitable for action scenarios. Luckily, it was forgotten pretty quickly. The following decade went by fairly quietly for Jonathan Crane. Sure, we had some great stories like No Man's Land in 1999, which effectively proved that Scarecrow doesn't need his fear drugs to be a big threat. And in 2003, the animated series version of the character returned for the video game Batman: The Rise of Sin 2, again voiced by Jeffrey Combs. But nothing truly groundbreaking was done with the old Duke of Fright. He just cruised along like before, not doing bad, but also not striving for greater levels of success. Then in 2004 came the arc As the Crow Flies. In this story, Jonathan is used as a cheap patsy by the Penguin, who has a good professor transformed into a giant scarecrow monster called the Scarebeast. It's all part of a ploy by Oswald to get rid of his underworld rivals. Poor Crane was now out of the blue portrayed as a loser villain, and as a result, a brief trend arose where such was the character's place. The guy who had slowly been dragging himself up the Batrogue totem pole since the 60s was now cast down to the bottom, and for no apparent reason. Luckily, that big break he'd been longing for so long was just around the corner. Since late 1996, Scarecrow had been struggling to get into a live-action movie. After seeing the dailies of Batman and Robin, Warner Brothers were for some bizarre reason really pleased, immediately greenlit a fifth Batman movie, and hired Batman Forever and Batman and Robin director Joel Schumacher to make it. Schumacher in turn hired screenwriter Mark Protosevich to supply the script, and his story called Batman Unchained, often incorrectly referred to as Batman Triumphant, featured Crane as the main villain alongside Harley Quinn. Actor Nicolas Cage was considered for the role. Of Crane, that is. However, when Batman and Robin was finally released and received nothing but scorn from both the public and the critics, Warner Brothers got cold feet regarding a fifth movie. They thus put the project on ice, denying the Master of Fear both his live-action and feature film debut. Nevertheless, in 1998, Lee Shapiro and Stephen Wise pitched the studio with yet another script for Batman 5. This one was called Batman Dark Knight, and took some cues from the celebrated graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns, featuring a retired Batman. Scarecrow was once again the main villain, and the story had him transform his colleague Dr. Kirk Langstrom into the hideous Man-Bat, who would have been the secondary villain. Having lost interest in a straight-up sequel to the Burton Schumacher movies, Warner Brothers passed on this one too, thus yet again denying Johnny his big break. Another Batman movie had to be made eventually though, and in 2005 came the day when the Prince of Panic finally got his long-awaited live-action and feature film debut. The movie was called Batman Begins, a complete reboot of the old film series, and features Scarecrow as the villain alongside Ra's al Ghul. Cillian Murphy portrayed Johnny in the film. So now he'd done it at last, starred in a big blockbuster movie, a guarantee to widespread fame, right? It's certainly true that Batman Begins helped introduce Crane to a larger audience beyond that of what the cartoon shows had. A live-action film is after all that golden ticket that all supervillains and superheroes desire. But Scarecrow's deal hadn't been quite perfect. The character mainly just appears in the second act of the movie, and he plays a subservient role to the true primary villain, Ra's al Ghul, who uses Johnny as a pawn in his master plan. Batman Begins' unambitious depiction of the Master of Fear thus failed in catapulting him to iconic status. The Scarecrow did not become a household name along the lines of Joker, Riddler, and Penguin. To this version's credit, however, it was the first cinematic Batrogue to return in sequels, as Murphy reprised his role for both of them, The Dark Knight in 2008 and The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, albeit merely in small cameos. Murphy also reprised his role as Crane for the video game Batman Begins, based on the movie, released around the same time. The Dark Knight trilogy version of Scarecrow also showed up in a segment of the animated anthology movie Batman Gotham Knight, released in 2008. It was set in the same universe as the live-action films, kind of, and took place between the events of Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. Murphy was absent this time around, and Jonathan found himself voiced by Corey Burton instead. A completely unrelated version of the character appeared briefly on the cartoon show Batman the Brave and the Bold during this era as well. While Christopher Nolan's Scarecrow, as seen in the Dark Knight trilogy and its related media, remains fairly popular among fans, it just wasn't really what the character had been waiting for so long. It seemed like despite his successes, something was always trying to keep the frightful villain down. Well, better days were coming, but it wouldn't be in the shape of movies, animation, or comics. The Master of Fear had certainly made his fair share of video game appearances, but in the grand scheme of things, none of them had been particularly noteworthy. So who knew that it would be video games that finally gave old Strawhead the respect he so rightfully deserved? 2009 saw the release of the first entry in the massively popular Batman Arkham game series, Batman Arkham Asylum. The game features Crane as one of the main villains, and with his unique design and freaky voice performance by Dino Andrade, we got perhaps a more terrifying Scarecrow than we'd ever gotten before. He truly lived up to his gimmick of fear. This version ended up being one of the most memorable characters in the game, and immediately became a fan favorite. It made many people realize just the type of potential Crane held. He was capable of so much more than playing second fiddle to a so-called bigger rogue. He could be a truly frightening boogeyman. Despite the character's popularity, he was excluded from the first two sequels to Arkham Asylum, Arkham City and Arkham Origins. However, he returned with a bang for the fourth and as of yet final entry in the series, Arkham Knight. In this game, Crane was promoted to the main villain and sported a new yet equally terrifying look, while John Noble replaced Dino Andrade. If Arkham Asylum made people realize Scarecrow's potential, Arkham Knight certainly hadn't fully lived up to it. The character's newfound success within video games continued in 2017's fighting game Injustice 2, the sequel to 2013's Injustice: Gods Among Us. Crane was given the honor of being one of few Batrogues to appear as a playable character in a fighting game. In-game, he appears as a nightmarish monster creature, brought on by the effects of his fear toxin. Horror icon Robert Englund fittingly voiced him, a match made in heaven. Scarecrow had earlier also appeared in the LEGO Batman video game franchise, the computer game DC Universe Online, as well as a few minor titles here and there. Despite existing for nearly 80 years in comic form, it was the world of gaming that truly made the dreaded Prince of Panic into a star. His fanbase has as a result exploded in recent years. Meanwhile, the comics offered us a brand new take on Jonathan's origins during the New 52 in 2012. This take included his father, who's the real reason Johnny became the Scarecrow, as while a kid his dad subjected him to cruel fear experiments. This version made quite an impact, as it was used as the main inspiration for Scarecrow's second live-action portrayal, namely on the TV series Gotham. On the show, Crane is played by Charlie Tahan, and just like in the New 52, it's Jonathan's father who subjects him to fear toxin, setting him on his path to become the Scarecrow. Gotham marked the first time the character ever appeared on a live-action TV series. And now we basically caught up to speed with the Scarecrow, and this is where we stand. So there you have it. That's the history of the Master of Fear himself. His journey hasn't been as dramatic as the Riddler's, and as a result, maybe not quite as interesting. So what's next for the King of Spook? I personally feel he's still got a long way to go. Sure, while he's more popular than ever before, I wouldn't say he's a pop culture icon. To become that, I do strongly believe Crane needs that big movie. He has to be the main villain in a live-action film, and fully decked out in a freaky costume too. None of that business suit crap. Give him a damn hat too. This has to happen sooner or later. Batman Begins just wasn't good enough for the character. Not nearly good enough. Sure, it helped him gain some wider fame, but in a way it also kinda hurt him, spreading the image of him as a fairly weak villain. Crane also needs to make a comeback in cartoon shows. He's made some excellent animated appearances in the past, but it's been quite a while now. As for the comics themselves, we've gotten some great stories, but we still don't have that definitive Scarecrow story. His killing joke, so to speak. That needs to happen too. The only place where Crane doesn't need improvement is in video games. He's doing just fine in that department. So which version of the Terror Tyrant is your favorite? Superfriends, Batman the Animated Series, the new Batman Adventures, the Dark Knight trilogy, the Arkham games? Let me know in the comments. Next up in this series is Rogue's personal favorite rogue, that split-faced fiend, the living Jekyll and Hyde himself, Harvey Dent, aka Two-Face. He's up in the very next video too, as I review the movie Batman vs. Two-Face. Anyway, as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.